I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you episode number 57 in this podcast, dedicated to the improvement of your brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is a Christmas time episode, or a couple days before Christmas here, and as we have for the past couple holidays, started to kind of think, okay, what can we do that would be appropriately holiday themed? We've actually got one which lines up pretty well. We're calling this episode Santa's Stimulant, because we found a nootropic plant which seems like it's the kind of thing that Santa probably should use if he's not using it already. This plant, which grows in very, very cold climates, has been known for improving mood and getting rid of depression, which of course is helpful if you have to be jolly. It can be used to prevent altitude sickness, which is helpful when you're flying a sleigh at high altitudes. It may reduce fatigue, which is handy when you have to stay up all night traveling around the world, and has been found to show improvements in both physical and mental performance. The plant that I'm talking about is called Rhodiola Rosea, and we're going to be speaking with Dr. Patricia Gerbarg, who has literally written a book on Rhodiola Rosea and is quite the fan of the plant, as you will hear. If you stick around until the end of the episode, I'm going to tell you one simple trick that anybody with two legs can use to find out whether you may be at risk for cognitive decline, senior dementia, if you might have had a small stroke and not known about it, and things like that. But before we get to any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so you may have heard of synesthesia. Synesthesia is really interesting. That is the name for it when people basically have their senses kind of entangled. And people who are synesthetes say that they do things like they hear colors, like they might see the color red and that's associated with a certain tone or like a music, or they can taste sounds, like a certain word might conjure a sound or a smell to them. It's basically just like a miswiring of the normal five senses that everybody has. But it almost kind of sounds like a superpower because on the one hand, it's not necessarily an accurate representation of reality, but one thing that it has been handy for in the 4.4% of the population that is somewhere on the synesthete spectrum is that it kind of gives people another way of remembering things, of having like a mnemonic device. Like, like when a word's on the tip of your tongue and you're like most of us who aren't synesthetes, you might kind of like hear the sound of the word, but you can't quite get it. But a synesthete might have another clue. It's like if your memory banks aren't being able to call it up from what it sounds like, you might be able to think, okay, well, that word tastes like whatever. Carrot cake. Oh yeah, it's bulldozer. That's the word. Bulldozer tastes like carrot cake or whatever. So anyway, up till now, synesthesia is something that you either have or you don't have. It's an interesting oddity. It's probably most people that have synesthesia would not consider it a superpower, just kind of one of those things. But in a new study by researchers at the University of Sussex, they found that by performing daily brain exercises on regular non-synesthetic people, they can actually train them to have synesthete-like powers, although these powers fade once they stop doing the training. Researchers trained people for 30 minutes a day over a 9-week period. 14 participants, and they were taught to associate 13 letters with particular colors. And not only were they able to begin to see those letters when they would appear in text as certain colors, but many of them began to associate emotions with certain letters. Some of them reported that the letter X felt boring, while the letter W felt calm. One really interesting result of this study was that the group that performed the training experienced an average jump of 12 IQ points from the beginning to the ending of the study. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that these people got smarter. This probably says more about the way that IQ tests are administered, which has a lot of emphasis on pattern recognition and memory, which, as I mentioned, is the kind of thing that synesthetes kind of have another additional handle on that most of us don't. But still, 9 weeks and a 12 IQ point jump is nothing to sneeze at, said the co-lead of the study, Daniel Bohr. The main implication of our study is that radically new ways of experiencing the world can be brought about simply through extensive perceptual training. The cognitive boost, although provisional, may eventually lead to clinical cognitive training tools to support mental function in vulnerable groups, such as children with ADHD or adults starting to suffer from dementia.
Smart Drug Smarts.
And in decidedly less psychedelic news, picked up a 5-star review on iTunes from Thuge5432, who said succinctly, the best of the class. Thanks, Thuge. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Rhymes with Scrooge, so it's Christmassy. And I've said it before, I will no doubt say it again, but thank you to everybody who has left us any sort of positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or dropped us an email or any sort of that audience feedback stuff. It's all very, very much appreciated and has made doing the podcast a real pleasure. In addition to, of course, talking with the guests, which is a thrill unto itself, it's really awesome knowing that other people out there in the world, all over the world now, are getting something out of this whole little Smart Drug Smarts experiment as well. But before I get all blubbery and start being the guy to embarrass himself at the Christmas party, let's move on to the main interview. Dr. Patricia Gerbarg is an assistant clinical professor in psychiatry at New York Medical College. She graduated from Brown from Harvard Medical School, and she has been lecturing and teaching about a wide range of topics in psychiatry, psychoanalysis, women's issues, trauma, neurobiology, natural treatments, and the integration of mind-body practices since before I was born. So she's got a long track record in the field of things related to our minds. She practices integrative psychiatry, combining standard and complementary treatments, and her research focuses on mind-body practices for reducing the effects of stress and trauma, particularly in survivors of mass disasters. So a pretty interesting background. We're going to be talking with her about Rhodiola Rosea. She's the author of a book called The Rhodiola Revolution. Now, Rhodiola Rosea is a plant that is classed as an adaptogen, which is a pretty rarefied air for plants. It's a plant whereby the administration of that plant results in the stabilization of physiological processes and the promotion of homeostasis, which is basically what you want to have when your body is having all of its processes correctly balanced off against one another. Homeostatic equilibrium is what they call it. So we start out talking about what adaptogens are and then going into Rhodiola Rosea in detail.
In order to qualify as an adaptogen, it has to be able to protect an organism from multiple stressors that would include oxidative damage, physical damage, extreme heat, extreme cold, chemical toxins, and even psychological stressors. So that's a tall order for these extracts. And because of that, there are only a very small number of herbs that have been identified as what are called true adaptogens. There are other herbs that have some of these properties, and they're considered to have adaptogenic properties, but to be a true adaptogen, you've got to really be able to do many different kinds of protective actions.
A lot of good things to fit into one plant. It almost sort of sounds like a miracle drug.
Well, the difference between plants and synthetic drugs is that synthetic drugs are kind of designed to do one or two things. Maybe they have one main effect and lots of side effects. Whereas in plants, for example, in Rhodiola Rosea, which we'll be talking about today, the plant parts, in this case the roots, contain literally hundreds of bioactive compounds. For example, salidroside is one of the compounds in Rhodiola Rosea, is known to have some of the biologic activity. The other compounds, some of them are called rosavins, which are quite specific, and so they're considered to be marker compounds. By that we mean that if you have a batch of some herbal mix, how do you know for sure where it comes from? How do you know someone hasn't put in other things to kind of bulk it up? And one of the ways is to have what are called marker compounds that are unique to that plant. So through a process called liquid chromatography, you can separate out all the different components and look at the profile of compounds in it and then specifically identify the herb. So for rhodiola in the past, salidrosides and rosavins have been used as marker compounds. But what's been happening, unfortunately, is that it's now possible to synthesize some of the marker compounds using living organisms like yeast. And so companies are able to synthesize some of these and add them in to make their product seem more potent than it really is. So the whole area is going through a lot of change, and the testing has to be much more sophisticated.
Okay, so let's jump over to Rhodiola Rosea and talk a little bit about the history of that plant, because it sounds like the history goes back a long way, and it's pretty interesting.
It's very interesting. Rhodiola grows at high altitudes, 8 to 10,000 feet in certain mountain ranges where it's very cold, such as in Siberia, the Altai Range, the Caucasus Mountains in the Republic of Georgia, grows a bit in Scandinavia, Alaska, and in northern Canada. Naturally, it grows in the wild. And basically, when the snow melts, just below the snow line, as the snow melts, the plant has 6 weeks in which to blossom, propagate, And then the snow comes back and the whole plant goes underground into the root. So in order to be able to do that, and the soil is very poor, it's a high altitude, not a lot of oxygen, there's a higher level of radiation from the sun. So all of the growing conditions are extremely difficult. And for a plant to develop the ability to survive in those conditions, it has to have some very powerful compounds. And we think that because of the harshness of the conditions, that is why these plants have so many of these compounds, because they have to protect the plant and they have to enable it to thrive under those conditions. And it turns out that a lot of those compounds that give the plants its powers are also active in animal systems and in humans and give us some of those powers. So that's the basic background of it. It has been used for thousands of years by people who live in those mountainous areas. Basically, certain tribes and families knew where the wild root grew. It was kept secret. They would harvest it, and then they would trade it for other goods that they needed. You know, they'd come down from the mountains maybe and trade it for honey or fruit or whatever it was. And in the ancient days, for example, some of the kings in China would send expeditions up to trade in order to get what they called the golden root or the kingly root, because it was very treasured as a way for the royalty to maintain their health and longevity, and they also believed their sexual abilities by using this herb. Now, the local people also use the herb as a way to survive because it enhances the ability to survive at high altitudes. And the other thing that happens at high altitudes is fertility goes down. So there was a custom among the villagers that when a young woman got married, her girlfriends would present her with a huge bouquet of rhodiola roots, which were believed to enhance fertility and assure the birth of lots of healthy children. Now, the families there, what they would do is they would basically chop up the root, put it in a vat of water, and stick it in a closet or a cabinet for a few weeks and let the water extract the herbs. Then they would put it in a kettle over their fire and boil off until they had a tea. The entire family would drink the tea, the young and the old, and this was believed to fortify them and able to survive the harsh conditions. And to this day, rhodiola root is still used for people. For example, if you're going to go climbing in those mountains, there will be people by the roadside with little vials of rhodiola root in an alcohol extract selling it to travelers so that they can survive better when they go up into the mountains.
Is this the Caucasus Mountains that we're talking about?
Yes, exactly. Now, we know that it goes back a long time because the famous Greek physician Dioscorides mentioned it in his famous book, De Materia Medica, which was the medical textbook for 1,000 years before modern medicine. But we also found there was a mention of it in an ancient Bronze Age Greek myth, which was the Argonautica.
Jason and the Argonauts.
Exactly. Medea was the daughter of the king in Colchis, and she was put under a spell and fell madly in love with Jason, who had come there to try to retrieve the Golden Fleece. And her father was hell-bent on killing Jason because he didn't want to relinquish the Golden Fleece. So he was planning to have him have to fight with two fire-breathing bulls that were sure to kill him. And when Medea got wind of it, she was determined to save his life. So she prayed to the goddess Hecate. Medea was a famous herbalist. I mean, she was known for her potions and poisons and things. And we suspected that she might have known about this because the land of Colchis, which is where the myth took place, has now the modern country, the Republic of Georgia. So it was the same area where this herb grows. And according to the myth, she went up into the mountains and Hecate instructed her to harvest a particular root. And the description of that plant and that root in the myth is an exact description of the Rhodiola Rosea plant. And she extracted the root and made a potion, which was called the Charm of Prometheus. And the reason it was called the Charm of Prometheus was because Prometheus, if you remember, was punished by the gods for giving fire to man. And his punishment was that he was chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. And every day, a giant eagle would come and peck out his liver. And he would be in agony up in these mountains. And this was to go on for eons to punish him. The liver has a lot of regenerative powers, you recall. So when the eagle would peck out chunks of his liver and fly back to her nest, pieces of that liver from Prometheus would drop from her beak onto the rocks below. And as the myth goes, wherever that dropped, it was called ichor, that's where the Rhodiola Rosea plant would grow. It grew out of the liver of Prometheus, which is why it had all these magical regenerative powers. So in any event, she went up, she got the herb, she made a potion. The potion was called the Charm of Prometheus. She gave it to Jason, and he rubbed himself all over with it, and then he suddenly was bursting with energy and power and jumping around, and his muscles were bulging, and he was able to defeat the bulls and survive and go on to bring back the Golden Fleece to Greece. Now, in the myth, it never mentions the name of the herb, but it's very clear if you know the herb and you know that it grows there, it's the only herb of that description. So we've kind of identified this as the earliest recorded use of Rhodiola Rosea. So it was interesting to see that they knew the root. They knew it had the power to strengthen, give people increased physical endurance and strength. And then the mythological aspect was explaining how this root would have such amazing restorative abilities.
So if you're looking for a nootropic that'll help you fight fire-breathing bulls, it's the way to go.
That's the one you want.
So tell us a little more about the everyday effects that somebody who is taking Rhodiola Rosea can expect.
Well, the first thing that most people notice, some people notice it immediately, some people it takes a few days, is that there's an increase in the feeling of energy, both physical and mental energy. Then in addition to that, over time, it takes a little longer for some of the other effects, but it does improve mental clarity, memory, increased speed of recall. You know, as people get older, it takes longer for them to retrieve information. This tends to speed up that process so that they can access their memories more easily. It enables people to maintain mental focus for many hours longer than they normally would, and to perform mental tasks, making far fewer errors. So it improves accuracy as well as mental endurance. It also helps with mood and, in a sense, gives people a more positive attitude. In addition to that, it does improve physical endurance and performance. So it has many other effects, protects against oxidative damage, and so we think that it probably is an anti-aging substance, both in terms of the brain and the body, because it seems to work in a number of ways, which is understandable considering it has quite a few different compounds in it. But the net effect of the action of these is that it increases the ability of the mitochondria, which are the energy-producing organelles inside of cells. It increases their ability to produce high-energy molecules called ATP. And cells need these molecules because in order to do anything, the cell needs energy, right? Just like anything else, it's got to have fuel. So whatever task the cell has to perform, if it can keep producing energy, then it can keep performing that task without running out of energy. So if you increase the ability of the cells to keep producing ATP over a longer period of time, it doesn't matter what kind of cell you are. If you're a brain cell, then your brain functions longer, better. If you're a muscle cell, then your muscles aren't going to get as tired. If you're a heart cell, so forth. So because it's going throughout the body, each cell is able to do its job better and longer before it runs out of energy. But the other important aspect of this is that ATP is needed for cellular repair systems, because whenever a cell is burning energy, it releases free radicals internally. And so the more energy the cell is burning, the more free radicals it generates. And these free radicals are damaging all the cellular components. When the cells damage the mitochondria, which they do, then It's like the engines are being worn down. You use a car over a certain number of years, it's not going to be as efficient. So the cells have their natural ability to repair this oxidative damage, but the repair mechanisms also need energy, and they have their limits. If you have a situation where you're burning so much energy over time and producing so many free radicals that your repair systems cannot keep up with the damage, then you start to get cumulative damage. And that's what causes disease progression. When the body can't keep up with the damage that's occurring, both from internal oxidative damage and from external oxidative damage, which could be from any number of things, toxins we inhale, things that we eat that aren't good for us, just the process of aging, stressors that we are exposed to, and so forth. So this is what aging is about, whether you're talking about brain aging and the loss of cognitive functions, whether you're talking about physical aging, the development of cardiovascular disease, or any other physical ailment. So the more that we can repair our body tissues and prevent long-term damage, the more of a youthful system we're going to maintain. Now, I say this as a theory because it's really impossible to do long-term anti-aging studies. Nobody's going to get the money or the grant or the situation to do a 30, 40-year study, 50-year study to see what enables people to live longer. So nobody's going to do the studies that will prove that one thing or another has an anti-aging effect. All we can go on are understanding the mechanisms that make sense in terms of anti-aging effects. And there can be retrospective studies of people who've maybe taken the herb over many years. So the information isn't complete, but from what we can see in the short run in terms of the benefits and what we can understand in terms of aging processes, it would make sense that this kind of an herb would be beneficial in terms of preventing or delaying many of the aging processes that we're all struggling with.
Have there been animal studies on some of these anti-aging effects of Rhodiola rosea?
Well, there's actually been an enormous amount of research on Rhodiola rosea and a couple of the other adaptogens. In the former Soviet Union, the Ministry of Defense was very interested in developing adaptogen formulas. At that time, we were in the midst of the Cold War, and they were competing with the West, both militarily as well as in terms of scientific advancements. So at the time, their military were bogged down fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan, which were extremely treacherous and stressful. Combat, 4 hours sleep, constant danger, high altitude, cold, and they were not doing well because of the stress. So they tested about 160 different herbs and formulas, and they came up with a formula of 3 herbs: Rhodiola rosea, Schizandra canesis, and Eleutherococcus centicosus, which is also known as Siberian ginseng. And this formula was tested in their military, it was tested in their scientists, and it was tested in psychiatric patients, it was tested in many, because there was no human rights committee that they had to answer. And they did all kinds of psychological and performance and physical testing. And what they showed in these tests was that, yes, indeed, the formula increased physical endurance and performance, especially under stress. And the more stress there was, the more you could see the separation in performance between the groups that got the rhodiola and the herbal formula and those who didn't. They even tested this formula in their cosmonaut program. I don't know if you remember Polyakov. He was the most famous Russian cosmonaut. He was not only a cosmonaut, he was also a physician, and he set the record for the longest number of days in space, over 400 days in space. He was on the Mir space station. There were joint missions with NASA, and during his time on the space station, he was testing this formula on the cosmonauts, comparing the results with the tests that were being done on the cosmonaut teams on the ground, and demonstrating, for example, that they could tolerate changes in oxygen levels better, and that they could, a lot of what they had to do was sit for hours watching monitors boring monitors and be alert and able to respond to any sudden item or change that occurred on the monitor. It's very tedious work. And what they showed was that those who took this formula could perform with a great deal of accuracy for many, many hours longer than those who didn't take the formula. And other kinds of tests like that. Now, none of this was published because it was all classified under the Department of Defense. And they also used it in their Olympic athletes, by the way, especially the Winter Games where they did so well. In any event, in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the documents were declassified, but they were sitting in files in the basement of the Ministry of Defense. No one had access to them. And they actually were not allowed to publish them. They would have been executed or sent to the Gulag or something. They weren't allowed to speak about it. So no one saw this research. One of the scientists there, at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, the labs were in disarray. They lost their funding. They lost their structure. The scientists were scrambling to try to go other places. One of them came to the United States on the National Science Foundation grant. He was a very prominent professor, and he decided to import rhodiola. So he went back a number of times and went into the basements of the Ministry of Defense and collected the documents, went to the scientist's lab, got their documents, translated them, brought them here. And we were privileged that he shared all of that research with us, so we were able to see it.
Is we there the West in general, or is we you and your group specifically?
Me and my group consists of me and my husband, Dr. Richard Brown, who's also a researcher and a psychiatrist. So the two of us worked with the Russian scientists, Drs. Zakia Ramazanov, and we actually published the first review of rhodiola in English in a journal called Herbalgram for the American Botanical Council. Since then, there's been a lot more research on rhodiola and the other adaptogens, and it has been published. And what the research is going more and more into the molecular biochemistry, discovering very interesting things. For example, when you provide these herbal substances to cells, you increase the ability of the cells to repair damaged proteins. And damaged proteins are very important in terms of aging processes. They actually found that it upregulates or downregulates hundreds of different genes. So all of this genomic information is now being analyzed in terms of tracking down all the different pathways that are being affected. So there's a lot more that's coming out. And actually, there's going to be a comprehensive book about this research coming out sometime next year.
A lot of times, some of these compounds that seem to have beneficial effects, specifically on cognition, are great if somebody is already sort of falling off the cognitive cliff. It's late in life. They're on a mental downslope, but they don't necessarily have quite as beneficial effects for somebody that's still sort of in the prime of their life and has a healthy brain. But the fact that you're seeing these beneficial effects even in young military-age men is really quite promising. In all this silver lining, is there any dark spots? Are there any things that are not so nice about Rhodiola rosea?
Well, everything has its limitations. There is no panacea. And something that may work very well in some people will not necessarily have the same benefits in others. And that's true of everything. So it's not to say that everyone's going to get all the benefits. And it's also been tested in students, high school and college students, and shown to improve their general sense of well-being. What it does is improve stress tolerance would be the best way to describe it. So students under stress, for example, under exam stress, it will benefit them and probably enhance their performance academically as well. In fact, the Soviets used to use it there. They had like college bowl teams where they would have teams that would compete to answer questions, and they would have a schedule. They'd start several weeks before the competition with increasing doses of Rhodiola rosea so that they'd be at their peak performance for the competition. So in terms of potential risks and side effects, one thing is that Rhodiola rosea does have a stimulating action. It's not like amphetamines, which give you a big boost and then a crash. With Rhodiola rosea, there's a gradual boost and then a maintenance. It lasts for 6 to 7 hours. There isn't a crash. There's no addiction, no habituation, and no withdrawal syndrome. However, it does have stimulating properties. And there are people who are just sensitive to stimulants of any kind. So I usually ask people, does coffee make you jittery? Well, maybe you're sensitive to stimulants. You'd have to be careful with something like rhodiola. Also, I often advise people not to drink coffee at the same time that they're using rhodiola, or to severely reduce the amount of coffee, because the added stimulative effects can make the person feel jittery or wired. The main caution I have is for people who have, for example, bipolar disorder or manic depressive illness, because in those individuals, anything that's stimulating can trigger them into becoming agitated or hypomanic or even manic. So it has to be used very cautiously and under supervision, anybody with bipolar illness. It can be used, but again, you really have to know what you're doing. Sometimes people who are elderly or frail or who have severe anxiety problems, if you give them too much of a stimulant, it'll overactivate them, make them agitated, cause them to be more anxious. So in those cases, sometimes you have to start with really minute doses. You can get rhodiola in a capsule form, and so for those folks, I have them open the capsule and maybe just drop a pinch of it into a cup of tea as a test dose to see how they tolerate it, and then maybe little by little increase it for them. The dose range is quite a bit. Some people have a fantastic response to a tiny dose. Other people have to be increased up to 300, 400, 500, 600 milligrams a day. Occasionally we can go as high as 800 or 900 milligrams, but when you get into the higher dose ranges, it can have some effect on the platelets. So the person might start bruising more easily, and they have to be warned about that. One problem I've also seen is that some of the sports drinks are now putting rhodiola into their sports drinks in very large amounts, like 1,000 milligrams, and they have caffeine in the sports drink. So people who use these sports drinks can get huge doses of rhodiola and caffeine, and they can get very wired, and they can cause irritability of the heart.
One question that comes to mind as we're talking, I'm sure you're aware that L-theanine is something that's frequently taken in conjunction with caffeine to kind of counterbalance some of the stimulating effects as far as like raising heartbeat and things like that, but still having the benefits of increased mental alertness. Is that something that's been used in conjunction with Rhodiola Rosea?
Well, the herbal formula, which is called Adapt, which has rhodiola, schizandra, and eleutherococcus in it, those three are all adaptogens, and they balance one another and to have just that effect. So for people who can't tolerate quite as much stimulation from the rhodiola, the schizandra and the eleutherococcus balance it out very nicely. So sometimes for older folks who are having cognitive problems, I may recommend that because you get a lot of adaptogen benefits with a lower dose of the rhodiola. Now, generally, rhodiola is both energizing and calming in general, if you're not overusing it. So it has both those benefits. But for people who are sensitive, sometimes the blend of Adapt works better.
This is something that's metabolized fairly quickly within the body, maybe a half-life of 4 to 5 hours. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it usually takes effect within about a half an hour. And some people last all day, some people last 4 to 6 hours. We generally have people take it in the morning to be sure that it wears off before they need to go to sleep, and not to take it in the late afternoon or evening because it can disrupt sleep. Now, if you're pulling an all-nighter and you want to study, that's a whole other story. You might want to use it later in the day. Sometimes we give people a second dose midday. If it tends to wear off by 3 o'clock and they want it to go into the evening, they can take a second dose midday. And we advise people to take it about 20 minutes before a meal so that they have it on an empty stomach, just because it'll absorb better that way.
And what's your personal usage of rhodiola like? Is this a daily supplement for you?
Well, I've been using it now for about 20 years, every day. I first started taking it in the 1990s. Actually, I was my husband's first guinea pig, and we always try the things we recommend in terms of herbs. In any event, my situation was a little bit different because at that time, I was suffering from Lyme disease. I live in an area where there's a lot of Lyme disease, and I had gotten infected. I had gotten ill, and at the time, not as much was known about it, so the diagnosis was missed for 5 years, and as a result, the Lyme infection spread into my brain and was causing very severe, not just physical, but mental impairments. I was pretty much an invalid in bed most of the time. My brain had slowed down. My memory was gone. I had literally hardly any memory capacity. And it was quite dire. I was treated with antibiotics finally for about 9 months, but the damage was so extensive that I only had a partial recovery. So at that time, my husband, who's very knowledgeable about herbs and is also a psychopharmacologist and teaches at Columbia and so on, he had just learned about rhodiola and brought some home and said, "You want to try this?" Well, I was already taking about 50 different supplements that were kind of keeping me going. So I said, absolutely, anything. He said, well, maybe it'll give you some more energy. So I said, well, I could certainly use that because I had both chronic fatigue, Lyme disease, constant pain, all those things that go with it. So I started taking it, and 10 days later, my brain started working again. And then over a period of a couple months, my brain functions and memory were restored. And we said, oh my God, nobody knows about this. And there are all these people with Lyme disease and other conditions. Nobody's ever heard of this thing. So because of that experience, that really inspired me to write our first book on it, which was called The Rhodiola Revolution.
You're obviously a giant proponent of this. You've been using it yourself. You've written a book. Just for the sake of disclosure, do you have any vested financial interests, like owning a rhodiola plantation or something like that, that people should know about?
Absolutely none. Neither my husband or I accept any kind of payments from any herbal companies. We don't market it. We don't sell it. We think that's extremely important in terms of our credibility and our ability to help people. We do advise people about rhodiola research, but we have not been paid anything for any of our work with rhodiola.
Is there anything that you'd like to circle back to, any questions that I should have known enough to ask, but I skipped over?
I could go on forever about Rhodiola Rosea. One concern I did have, because it enhanced fertility, I was concerned about whether it had estrogenic effects that might be a risk for women. And I was fortunate to be able to contact a researcher named Patricia Gerbarg, who had just gotten a $250,000 grant to study estrogenic effects in herbs. And I convinced her to study Rhodiola Rosea first, which she did for a year. She studied it in mouse models, and what she found was that Rhodiola Rosea extract, when taken by mouth, did not cause estrogenic effects. It did not cause enlargement of the uterus or anything else. She also tested it in cancer cell lines, breast cancer cell lines, and found that it did not increase the proliferation of the breast cancer cells. So what she did find was that it tended to normalize estrogen levels. So if the animal's estrogen was too low, it brought it up a bit. And if it was too high, it brought it down a bit. It does attach to estrogen receptors, but it doesn't stimulate them. It works in some other way that we don't yet understand, but there didn't seem anything to indicate it would be a risk. And in fact, there have been quite a few studies of human cancers transplanted into animals showing that Rhodiola Rosea not only helps kill cancer cells, but it protects bone marrow and liver cells from the toxic effects of chemotherapy drugs. And this has been tested in numerous types of cancer. Now there have been a couple of small studies showing that Rhodiola Rosea and some of its related species, actually even in humans, have anti-cancer effects. So we've been trying to convince oncologists for years to let their patients take rhodiola, because one of the biggest problems with cancer is the patients are so fatigued and they have brain fog. Rhodiola is very good for fatigue of any cause, whether it's caused from physical exhaustion or from being on chemotherapy or from having cancer or medication side. It doesn't matter. It helps to improve energy and alertness. So it would be an ideal adjunctive treatment for cancer. But at this stage, there isn't enough information, and oncologists are so afraid of, exacerbating the situation that most of them are reluctant to use it.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you very, very much to Dr. Gerbarg for sharing her time with us and giving us such a resoundingly positive review of Rhodiola Rosea. I have not yet tried it myself, but after doing that interview, I'm pretty much going to head straight to my local nutrition store and see if I can find it, because there's not a whole lot not to like in the interview we just heard. So once I get that into my medicine cabinet, I will certainly give you guys my own thoughts. And also wanted to do a little bit of a follow-up from last week's episode. There's a few of us, myself included, who had our curiosity piqued enough by the idea of doing a week-long water fast in the interests of completely starving out any little nascent globules of cancer within our bodies that there may be a few of us interested in doing that at some point this coming year, sometime in 2015. So if you're weird enough that you might want to participate with a group of us all doing that the same week, totally as yet unplanned, this is just sort of the vaguest of vague ideas, but it seems like the kind of thing that would be unpleasant enough that you'd probably want to be commiserating with some online friends during the process of doing it. Anyway, just know that that idea is kind of swirling around. If it's something that sounds perversely interesting to you, drop me an email, jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. And now, as promised, the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So this particular ruthless listener retention gimmick is probably a little bit more for the older members of the audience. Although interesting to everybody, especially if you like standing on one leg. Why would you do this? Why would you stand on one leg? Well, as the researchers at the Center for Genomic Medicine at Kyoto University in Japan explained to some 1,400 volunteers with an average age of 67, by standing on one leg, we might get a better insight as to whether your brain is functioning properly, if you can balance on one leg. So what they did is they had everybody stand on one leg with their eyes open, and they asked them to balance for up to 60 seconds. Everyone tried this twice, and then the best time that any particular person had was used for the analysis. Then, using MRI, the research team scanned everyone's brain. What they found was that people that could not balance for 20 seconds almost invariably had cerebral small vessel disease, even though they weren't exhibiting any classic symptoms. Small vessel disease is related to stroke, dementia, and even Parkinson's. And among the people that were balance impaired, 45% had either one or two microbleed brain lesions, and a whopping 51% had either one or two arterial brain blockages, which is not something you want to have. So hopefully all of you are standing on one leg by now and timing yourself. And if you cannot make that 20-second threshold, then you might want to go consult your physician. If you can, congratulations, your brain is probably doing all right. And if anybody mocks you for standing on one leg while listening to this podcast, you can tell them with smug satisfaction that it's only because you care more about your brain health than they do. So there.
Smart Drug Smarts. The podcast so smart, we have smart in our title. Twice.
Okay, that's the episode. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and anything else that you might happen to be celebrating this time of year. Hope that all is well with you as we ring out 2014, and we'll be back at you at least once, maybe twice more this month before we see it into the next year. As usual, everything we talked about in this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com with links and all that good stuff, and I will be back at you very soon with the same unflagging commitment helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great holiday, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not. And the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.